Splurge, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa emphasized that Africa's relations with China would not lead the continent to an economic doom. This is contrary to foreign media allegations stipulating that China is pushing for small and smarter loans to Africa to shield from risk. It is worthy of note that President Ramaphosa's statements come to add weight to President Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo's remarks that outline China's commitment to Africa's development, praising it as a reliable partner to the African continent. As per reports, the financial support will be given for a duration of over 3 years. Nonetheless, China's promise to carry out 3 times as many infrastructure projects across the continent in recent years has become the focus of intense geopolitical competition between global powers like China, Europe, and the United States. What are the implications of this fresh funding, especially in the wake of Africa's looming debt crisis? Join us as we unpack these in today's topic of discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Stay with us. Hello, fellow televiewers and listeners of UPAN African channel for you, Media Africa. Thank you immensely for joining us this day on Talking Points, where we focus on the FOCAC Summit 2024, that is the China-Africa Cooperation Summit, which is concluding this day in Beijing. And of course, it should be noted that over 50 African heads of state actually made it to the summit in Beijing, China. And of course, during the summit precisely on Thursday, as we mentioned in our preamble, we saw China that pledged some $51 billion funding, a new fresh funding to the African continent in terms of economic development and infrastructure. Meanwhile, to evoke this topic of discussion this day, we have been joined all the way from the U.S. Dr. Stanley Afongat, who is a Pan-Africanist and he doubles as an economist. Thank you immensely for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for having me, and thank our viewers for watching. Thank my co-panelists for joining as well. I hope today we will be having a fruitful conversation.
Away from the U.S. now, we step foot on the African continent, and we have been joined by Mr. Opolo Taiwo, who is the Executive Director at the Africa Bridge Initiative, joining us all the way from Nigeria. Thank you immensely, sir, for joining us on this day.
Oh, good afternoon. Good afternoon, viewers. Good to be here all the way from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you for having me.
Thank you immensely for honoring our invitation. And we shall equally be joined with the insights of Mr. Gilbert Kimbe, who is a marketing consultant who shall be contributing this day and joining us all the way from Cameroon. So in a bit to dive into today's topic of discussion, the menu on the table this afternoon, we shall be trying to understand the implications of this fresh funding made to African nations. And of course, I will debut with you, Mr. or Dr. Stanley Afongat. Now, what's your appraisal of this new funding initiative made to African nations in the sum of a pledge of $51 billion?
I'm not a fan, to say the least. I'm not a fan when the continent of Africa borrows, beg, or do whatever it takes to be able to collect money from some outside sources. I'm not a fan. Unfortunately, we are living in the world where we have to be able to somewhat, coexist with others, especially when it comes to the issues of trade. The largest trading country in the world by volume is China. I understand that over 3.1 trillion US dollars, annually. That's our trading volume, which is way larger than most economies across the world. I fully embrace that idea, but the reality is I'm kind of, conflicted being able to appreciate, and talk about what this means, and also being able to look at the continent of Africa going, in the words of Patrice Lumumba, going to the dinner table, not as a participant, but as to what is to be served. Because whatever the West did to Africa, I see China doing that now on the African continent. Here we are collecting 1.5 point something billion, I think.
51 billion dollars.
What was it again?
$51 billion.
$51 billion dollars. We are collecting 51 billion, and for what? For road infrastructure. We are collecting, and all of that is loan. Make no mistakes, every penny of that amount of money we will have to pay back. But here's the interesting thing. China is giving us papers, and China is going to bring into the continent, hard technology. China is going to bring Chinese to come and build up whatever stuff they're trying to build on the African continent. China will continue to expand her economy. China will make sure that all the money that is spent on the continent of Africa is spent by Chinese with Chinese and with Chinese interest. That is going to be we have seen this roadmap before. They have done this in many African countries. They get contracts to build roads, and guess who is building the roads? Chinese. They get contracts to build seaports, and guess who shows up as the workers in those environments? Chinese. So the notion that somewhat we're going to have maybe 1 million to 3 million, Africans that suddenly are employed by these Chinese firms is nothing else but pure fantasy. That's not the truth. Secondly, the 51 billion that we are receiving does not even make any sense anymore. So what China is doing is very clever. China will give us bonds. Those things comes as it's just paper, right? It's paper backed by paper. So they will bring us the machinery that we need. They will export it from their factories. We are paying for those things to come. So we are actually buying, at first, whatever is produced in China. We are growing that economy in China. We are not getting fair market value because obviously it's being given to us on a stated basis, rather than on a competitive basis where we bring in different, sellers who are in the same space. Somebody who is selling a particular machine, all right, maybe out in the UK or somewhere in Holland or Germany, has to compete with someone in China, but because China is funding, whatever we get will come from China. So there is no competition in terms of us getting the best value, for whatever we are trying to get out of China. It is stated they will give us whatever they are giving us at exemplary prices, all right, very high prices, and in turn expects us to pay for it. So all I'm saying is this: irrespective of whatever goes on, they are doing all of this, and then will still come back on the continent of Africa. And if you look at exactly where all of the money is going, is quite telling. That goes to road infrastructure, all right, communication, railways. All that gets towards collecting, extracting Africa's mineral resources out of Africa and then taking them out into China. Look at Cameroon, the seaport in Cameroon, same idea. The seaport in Cameroon has an extra terminal, that's in Kribi, Cameroon. It has an extra terminal, and that terminal is just for Chinese use. You know what that terminal is used for? Is to carry iron ore from inland and then bring them out of, to right there to that seaport and then ship them out to China. The same iron rods, the same irons that we need in Cameroon, it's being manufactured, the raw materials is being exported out of Cameroon to China, manufactured in China and resold to the Cameroonian. But at what price? At what price? So I'm quite conflicted, maybe subsequently as we begin to dive deeper into what this means, to the African, but, I'm quite conflicted that we have not learned anything from the West. I'm quite conflicted that we have people on the African continent that do not understand that we have more tangible resources on the African continent that is not mere paper. We have what is bigger than the US dollar on the African continent, and this is gold, diamond, cobalt, and all the mineral resources that we have that is bigger than all of these, red carpet garbage that is taking place in China. And unfortunately, since the African is going to be the African, and most of our leaders are quite, they don't have two functioning brain cells to understand what's going on, and those who are around with them are yes ma'am, yes sir, and they just go along. I mean, can you imagine one country basically sits down, call 55 African nations, and then to show up right there, in Beijing, and they just go like swarm of bees with with absolutely nothing, to think about. They just go there, take pictures, and like, thank you for the money. They are selling the continent of Africa wholesale. Unfortunately, the African would have to pay the price.
I'm going to take from what you said. You said Africa is a mineral-rich continent, and of course, is what understanding or highlighting that the continent is rich in several minerals. But the question is, do you think Africa knows its worth? But away from that, Mr. Opoluwa, we heard your co-panelists speaking. In line with what the South African president made his remarks while addressing the 2024 FOCAC summit, he said that this funding or the relations that the African continent has with China is in no way going to lead the continent into a debt trap. Now from that, in your opinion, what do you think are some of the underlying root causes of these looming debt crisis that over the years Africa still continues to talk about?
All right, so thank you for having me. That's a good question coming at the verge of the Beijing conference, talking about the 2024 FOCAC summit, which started year 2020. All right, so unlike my other panel have said, we must understand that in Africa, for instance, in Nigeria, we are currently building a $1 trillion economy as a GDP for Nigeria. All right, so we're also looking at building various businesses to be able to survive the 21st century economic challenges. So now beyond that, when you're building an economy as a nation, you look at your continent. How do you collaborate within the continent? Now, beyond the continent also, you also look at where do you get your funding in order to sustain the development pattern that you are growing in individual countries and the continent. Now, the nearest cake in the is coming from the China. Now, the Chinese relationship with Africa has been a very long relationship, but the relationship has not been seen to be as productive as we think it should have been. And for me, I would not really blame the Chinese leaders or the Chinese citizens. The blame game will still be on the African leaders. Now, when a country is giving out $51 billion into the continent, it is coming in 3 stages. Number 1, it is coming in terms of FDI, that is foreign direct investment. Number 2, it is coming in form of a loan. Number 3, it is coming in form of a grant. All right, so when it's coming in these layers, it shows that the grant will be minimal. The foreign direct investment will be minimal. The highest fund, as part of this 51 billion, will be coming through the loans. And when you're giving a man loans, for instance, if a commercial bank is giving you loan, no man gives you loan because of friendship. Every loan must come with an interest. There's always an interest on every loan being given, whether it's being given by a commercial bank or it's being given by a country to country. So this time around, more than 70% of that 51 billion that will be coming to the continent of Africa will be coming in form of a loan. And as of today, we are having a debt servicing ratio crisis already because we can't service our loan in the past. And now we are having another cake in form of another loan. So what does that mean? That shows to us that the development we are looking for might not be as smooth as we think, because the intentionality, the capacity building on the part of the political leaders, we are not seeing it. So signing the checks, collecting the loans, collecting the FDI is not really the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is for the intentionality of our political leaders to understand that if you are collecting $51 billion, what are you doing with that $51 billion? What are you going to be doing in the area of agriculture? What are you going to be doing in the area of infrastructure? What are you going to be doing in the area of security? What are you going to be doing in the area of technology innovation, including artificial intelligence? What are you going to be doing in the area of human capacity building? The political leaders, are they ready to channel this fund to all of these layers that I have highlighted? The answer is no. So our leaders must understand that collecting this cake is not the ultimate goal, but where is the cake going? And how are you sure you'll be able to pay back the interest on this particular loan? That is the challenge on the continent of Africa. And that is the challenge for the 33 countries in Africa that is going with China in the next 5 to 10 years of the economic development.
Thank you immensely, Mr. Taiwo. Just to reiterate, like you mentioned, in terms of capacity building on the African continent, Africa is indeed rich in terms of human capital. And of course, that is why we keep having partners coming to the continent. But away from that, Mr. Opoluwa, now, taking you over to you, Mr. Gilbert. Now, China has pledged this funding to the African continent and is expected to have a duration or to be dispatched over a duration of 3 years on the African continent in terms of economic cooperation. Now, this comes amidst the impending or looming debt crisis, which we have mentioned and your co-panelists have cited so far. But do you think that this timing is really perfect?
The timing of China's pledge of 51 billion for Africa over the next 3 years is indeed both strategic and complex, especially given the current debt crisis facing the continent. And let's break this down. First, the timing is significant because it aligns with Africa's urgent need for economic support. You know, the continent Africa is actively dealing with and struggling to manage the serious issues of debt, and many African countries struggle with, the high cost of servicing their debt. So a significant portion of government's revenues is allocated to debt repayments, which can, limit funds that are available for essential services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. So by pledging this substantial amount, China is offering critical financial resources that could help address immediate economic challenges. It could stimulate infrastructure development and boost industrialization efforts across Africa. So, however, the complexity of this timing cannot be overlooked. Africa's debt crisis is not just a financial issue, but also a structural one. Many African nations are already heavily indebted, and while additional funding, can provide relief, it's crucial to consider that the nature of this funding is it coming as a debt, as a grant, as an investment, or a combination of these? If not managed well, additional debt could, worsen the problem rather than solving it. Therefore, the effectiveness of this pledge will largely depend on how these funds are structured and utilized. So, China's funding comes with the opportunity to invest in key sectors like infrastructure, healthcare, and technology. So these investments have the potential to create jobs, enhance productivity, and foster sustainable economic growth. However, it's essential for African countries to leverage these funds in a way that, promotes long-term economic stability rather than short-term gain. So, furthermore, the timing of this pledge also offers a chance for African nations to renegotiate their existing debt agreements and, seek more favorable terms. With China's support, there could be room to advocate for debt relief or restructuring from other creditors. So, leveraging China's commitment as a negotiating tool. So, to round up with this, while the pledge is timely and potentially beneficial, it also brings the need for careful management and strategic use of these funds. The real challenge will be ensuring that this support translates into sustainable development and also addresses the root cause of the debt crisis in Africa. So effective planning, transparent implementation, and a robust financial management will be key to turning this opportunity into tangible benefits for Africa.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gilbert. Now, it's worth noting he went on over and over again, citing the issue of management. And that leads me to the next question to you, Dr. Fonga. You listened to your co-panelist, and of course, while listening to him, he evoked the issue of Africa better managing this splurge, or better still, this new fresh fund to the African continent, so it doesn't translate into, say, another pending debt crisis already added to the one that the African continent already has. So, do you share the same opinion as your co-panelist?
Well, look, we have been down this path before. I don't think that this is something that is quite new. As of 2020, remember the 40 billion that was handed over to Africa by China?
Absolutely.
We had the 40 billion US dollars handed over to Africa by 2020. We had over 3,000 Chinese companies that were operating as a result of that across the continent of Africa. And the idea was simple, that we wanted to be able to do the same thing that China has done. All those investments had to do with infrastructure, they had to do with transportation, they had to do with power, and they had to do with agriculture. And so we are quite clear, especially when it comes to understand fully who China is and what China is interested in doing. China is not interested in building Africa for Africans. China is interested in building Africa for the Chinese. They're interested in building Africa for their interest.
Yeah, but Dr. Fungut,
and it will be...
Dr. Fungut, sorry to cut you short, but while we're mentioning that China is building Africa for its own economy, it's equally worth mentioning, or I don't know, looking at, if we're having this conversation, is because we have this lack of accountability on the African continent. If we had, in the last summit, there was $40 billion that was actually received, and now we're receiving $51 billion. What has that money been used for? And are there any traces on the African continent that shows that there have been progress in the way this money has been used for the development of the continent?
The question is, if the Chinese government realizes that they handed 40 billion just over 3 years ago, and that 40 billion, they are now coming to give another 51 billion. That means the Chinese government is comfortable with whatever is going on in Africa. The only person who is absolutely raising an alarm bell is you and I. We are the ones who are saying something is amiss, something is wrong. Where are the developments? We have not seen anything. Where has the 40 billion gone to? Apart from the 40 billion, I want you to also understand in 2020, the rest of the world, especially EU, so about 3 countries in Europe, were able to fund to the tune of 240 billion on the African soil. Where is the development? I understand what you're saying in relationship to the fact that there's mismanagement. Of course, there's mismanagement. That is not the problem. The problem here is the fact that it's like having someone who is addicted to gambling, and then they keep coming to you and borrowing money, and you know they have this huge piece of land as collateral, and instead of saying, wait a minute, you have to be a little bit more responsible with your borrowing habits because you keep gambling this stuff away, sooner or later your collateral is gone. But the Chinese actually wants to take over the collateral. So what did they do? They keep giving you the money. Do whatever you want to do with it. The issue is we have to have real accountability on the continent in relationship to how we spend our money. There is the famed Cameroonian artist, I think Lapiro Dimbanga. He says something in Pidgin, which I'm just going to paraphrase. He says that, think about it this way. He says, imagine that, they keep talking about this issue about national debt, all right? It says national debt, national debt, national debt. They have taxed everybody on national debt. Even the person who is the little lady who buys vegetables and sells in Cameroon is called buy and sell them. It says they have taxed that individual too. It says, but here is the mystery about that national debt. He said, here's the premise. How much we owe, we do not know. How much we have paid, we don't know. What is the interest rate on the loan? We do not know. And how much is left to be paid? We do not know. And then he concludes by saying, this is grand fair for fair, right? Which basically means this is the highest form of 419, or this is the highest form of crookery. So this is exactly what we are facing on the continent. I fully understand that. My issue is this. I am looking at this predatory lending that is coming in from China, because China obviously knows exactly what she wants to get. And we are dealing with men who are running the continent, all right, president of individual nations, who rather have private jets, who rather have houses in Dubai, who rather build hospitals outside of the country rather than building it on the continent of Africa. That is the reality of where we stand. And just like my co-panelist said, I think that we really have to be able to have a discussion on the continent of Africa. I think the next generation of young men and women who are fighting to get into the public space needs to be able to say, wait a minute, where is this funding coming from, number one, and who has been receiving this funding and what is going on? We need to have a nationwide audit. Why not a continental audit? We need to know what the hell is happening with the money we have been receiving, how it's being spent, and who has benefited from this, exuberant amount of money coming in from the outside, and yet there is still mass poverty. Infrastructural development is nowhere to be seen, and the only areas that have been developed are the ones that are the areas that these companies or these countries are fully. By the way, when we talk about China, you have to fully understand that most of the Chinese firms that comes into Africa are actually owned by the Chinese company, by the Chinese government. It is not some privately owned company operating in China. No, those companies are fully controlled by China. So whatever they do on African soil is with the blessing of the Chinese government. So and obviously you will discover that most of those investments are done in areas of mining. You see them in oil, you see them in constructions of seaports. Reasons being because obviously that is their safe passage out of the continent to get whatever they're looking for. So we have to be a little bit more careful, especially when we look at this. It's not just, we have to look at this actually at the micro level, all right, before we even climb over to the macro level. So look, what are the impacts? What has this funding done on the continent of Africa? The only thing that is tangible that has happened as a result of the Chinese funding that has come into Africa is that Africa has had a net loss on every front, including the minerals that we have. There has been no positive gain. Somebody can fact check me on this. There has been no positive gain on economic terms. Africa has continually been losing. We are losing our minerals on a daily basis. It's exported out of the continent like there's no tomorrow. And even on top of that, as they are all the illegal minings that they are actually carrying out in Africa, which they cannot do in China, we are also losing land because the land from where these mining operations are taking place might not be, we might not be agriculturally suitable maybe for the next 50 years. That is how dire the situation is in Africa.
Thank you immensely, Dr. Fongot, for that brilliant insight. Of course, I'll channel this next question over to you, Mr. Opolo. When you listen to your co-panelist, and he cited a very pertinent point about, doing a research at the national level to be able to understand the implications, the impact this, pledges, or better still, this money has had on the individual countries and as a global state, the African continent. He equally mentioned the aspect of Africans actually trying to renegotiate or get into the table to reevaluate some of the terms of these loans in a bit to comprehend what they have paid, or what they have received, and possibly the interest which has been on these loans given to the African continent. But then, in a bit to ask you, you listen to your co-panelist and his point of view. Why do you think that we have, we still have more fundings coming to the African continent, though we have not, or we're yet to see some substantial impact, or or better still, the reasonable impact of these loans on the African continent? Where does it still come in? And why are Africans, is it a time for Africans to get to the negotiating table and renegotiate some of the terms of these grants, or better still, these fundings that are coming to the continent?
All right, thank you. So in answering your question, we're going to be looking at three phases to the question. Number one, Africa countries will continue to have challenge in the area of servicing loan. Why? Number one, our electoral processes are not seamless. Number two, we are busy funding our security challenges instead of reducing the security challenges. Number three, insincerity integrity issue on the part of our leaders. So let me go to the number one layer, talking about electoral processes. That is not seamless. When you have a particular political party taking over the country of Nigeria, taking over the country of Cameroon for the next 5 years, after that political party finish, if that party fail to win another election, development will do what? Stop. But since another party is taking over, another party will want to start all over again. So election and electoral mismanagement has always been a challenge and will always be a challenge to our economic development. If we don't get our electoral process right, we cannot get it right when it comes to economy. A party cannot develop Africa. A single man cannot develop Africa. A single man cannot develop any nations of Africa. If the people of the citizens are not fully part of the electoral process, then the economy cannot be seamless, because that is the challenge we're having. The people are being alienated from the electoral processes. Some don't even know how their leader came to be. They don't know how their leader came to power. You can imagine a man being in power since when I was born up to now, more than 30 years ago. Is that not a calamity? And you're looking for development. You can't see development. On the second layer, talking about the security challenges, political leaders in Africa are busy fueling and funding security challenges just to gain political power. So how do you expect to pay back the loan? Because whatever, any amount you are spending in your economy, it's not coming down from heaven. You are picking each naira, you are picking each dollar from the economy. So when we are not getting it right on the angle of security, then our economy cannot be seamless. And when the economy is not seamless, then paying back our loan or debt servicing will be a mirage. Number three, when we talk about our political leaders, talking about political alienation, how do we ensure that the citizens are part of the process? When the citizens are part of the process, the citizen will understand the antecedent of its political leaders. Because a man that does not have grip on his personal finance cannot have grip on the public finance. And that is the challenge we have in Africa. A man that does not understand economic turnover, how do you understand how to pay back a loan? When the former president Olusegun Obasanjo was in power, he went into the Western world seeking for debt cancellation through the Minister of Finance, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is currently the DG of the World Trade Organization. The question is, immediately he left power, different party has been able to take over Nigeria. Our loan in Nigeria has gone what? Has been skyrocketed. The same thing is happening to all the countries in Africa. So the citizen must wake up and challenge and look for what? Accountability from our political leaders. When we are sleeping as a citizen, the economy will be sleeping, because our political leaders are not fighting for the people, they are fighting for themselves. So looking for how to reduce our debts in Africa, the citizen has a lot of role to play in terms of sustainable economic development going forward. That is my stand for today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Opalua. Now, taking the reaction of Mr. Kimbe. Now, Mr. Kimbe, how would you, you listen to what Mr. Opalua had to say as far as that is concerned? Of course, it raises the question mark of how Africa can go about, this issue of its debt crisis. But then, how can Africa utilize, we have the FOCAC summit, which is concluding today. How can Africa actually utilize some of the resolutions or some of the, recommendations that were made or through these summit for its own competitive advantage?
Yeah, the FOCAC summit concluding on September 6th in Beijing presents a pivotal opportunity for Africa to leverage its strategic positioning and partnership with China to enhance its competitive advantage. I do agree. So here's how African nations can utilize this summit to their benefit. First, by creating strategic networking and partnerships. The summit provides an invaluable platform for African leaders to engage directly with Chinese officials and business leaders. So by actively participating in discussions and networking opportunities, African countries can forge stronger bilateral ties and secure new investment commitments. So this is a chance to present their most promising projects and sectors for investment, such as infrastructure, technology, and renewable energy, ensuring that they can align with China's strategic interests and development goals as well. Secondly, they can advocate for favorable terms. So Africa should use this summit to negotiate more favorable terms for funding and support. This includes seeking better conditions for loans, for grants, for investments, as well as advocating for increased flexibility and debt relief options. So by presenting a unified and strategic approach, African nations can negotiate from a position of strength and potentially secure more advantageous agreements. Thirdly, they can use this to showcase development goals. You know, the summit is an ideal platform for African nations to showcase their development strategies and goals. So by highlighting successful projects, progress in key sectors and future aspirations, African countries can attract further investment and support. This visibility can also help in setting the stage for future cooperation and partnerships that align with their long-term development plans. So in summary for these, the FOCAC summit is a critical moment for Africa to capitalize on its relationship with China by strategically engaging in networking, negotiating favorable terms, and showcasing development goals. So African nations can enhance their competitive advantage and secure long-term, benefits from their partnership with China.
Thank you so much, Gilbert Kimbe. Now, until Dr. Fongot, you listen to what your co-panelists had to say as far as that is concerned. In your perspective, why do you think African countries continue to regard, say, China as a reliable partner, or better still, other partners that come into the African continent?
Well, I think that the history of the colonial era on the continent of Africa has pushed Africa into the arms of China and Russia. So we are now looking at basically doing work with China, having those partnerships with China and Russia, rather than having the draconian colonial structures that we have, been under, for the last 60, 70 years. I mean, this is just when we had our sort of freedom, and not to count the number of years of slavery. So the African is tired. The African has looked at her development vis-a-vis the development of Europe and vis-a-vis the development of America, and have said to herself, you know what, this partnership has not worked out. But the same period of time, if you look at countries in Asia, they have developed tremendously under similar circumstances. But the problem with the African is that we have not just developed. And I think that it's because we had leaders on the continent of Africa that were sold out to this ideal of the West, that the West became their maker, the West became their Jerusalem, that the West became their, their place of refuge, that every single thing else that they wanted to do on the African continent had to do with the West. Unfortunately, this is what has led, to the stalemate that we have had on the continent of Africa in relationship to our development. The reality is, if you look at the amount of foreign direct investments that has come into the continent of Africa and what has been the measurable, tangible, benefit out of that, it's absolutely non-existent. Look at most of our airports on the African continent. You think that you're flying into some war zone. Land in a place like Douala, it is nothing to write home about. Land in a place like Accra, Ghana, I mean, they're actually trying to do something right now, but it is absolutely, nothing to write home about. Places like Yaoundé, I mean, you just go on, Kigali, you just go on and on. It's really shameful. But this is where we are. And unfortunately, we are trying to be able to talk about how we can be able to help the continent develop. I don't think that much money is what we need. We do not need loans for Africa to develop. We need Africans with the willpower and the mind to be able to build the continent, not to collect money that they don't even know how to be able to use the money and how to utilize it. So let me probably end this with this. Think about China. China basically gives us 51 billion, and China says, I'm going to invest heavily, especially in the areas of mining. All right, because that's what most of this money is for, is to collect most of our natural resources and take them out of the continent. So China builds a road, and so I'm going to give you road, good road infrastructure, but the road that they're building will have to lead from the port, to the mining area. All right, so they construct this wonderful road from the port to the mining area. Now, that is loan, okay? They gave us that money, we built the road, that's fine. But guess who uses the road? It is the same Chinese firm that is mining that uses the road for easy transportation of the minerals out of the mining area to the seaport. Likewise, you see that with the railways infrastructure that they're proposing on the African continent, we already have a template of that in a place called Cameroon. There's already a railway tracks built in Cameroon that is transporting iron ore, from inland and bringing it out to the seaport. I don't know exactly what else we need to be able to understand how China operates and what China is looking for. Don't blame, just like my companion says, we are not blaming the Chinese. China will do what China will do for the interests of our people. What I'm blaming is these men, these people, these, whatever you call them, that are running our individual nations, men whom, people like Patrice Lumumba will spit in their face, men whom people like Kwame Nkrumah will absolutely, throw water on them. It just with disgust and disdain because of what they're doing to the African. We carry our briefcases, our suitcases, and we go out there and we think we are all of that, and then we come back and collect all of this money, set up all of these things, eat the one we can eat, and then the rest of these guys, China is increasing, China is becoming, just like I said, China is has the largest trading volume for any country in the world. Most of the things manufactured in America actually comes from China. Unfortunately, Africa has all the raw materials to do likewise, but we have leaders on the continent of Africa that has no two functioning brain cells to be able to understand it and have the will, not the fortitude, to say, look, we have to do this from Africa with African initiatives, not the Belt and Road Initiative that China has. That Belt and Road Initiative with China means nothing so far as I'm concerned, so far as Africa is concerned. We have the money. You say, how do we have the money? Because we have the raw materials. How do we have the money? We have oil. How do we have the money? We have gold, we have copper, we have lithium. Everything the world needs, we have it right now. If Africa can just secure DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, take over DRC and say, you know what, all this madness taking place over here, we put an end to it. Just the wealth of DRC alone is enough to be able to solve Africa's issues. Even if we are not mining anything out of the DRC, we can just basically do a geological studies of everything that's in DRC, use a letter as a financial instrument and says this is what we have, and so everything that we're doing is based upon this. Likewise, any other country on the African continent. We don't need to collect money from anyone. All we need is to use our brains and say this madness has not worked. Why are we continuing on this trajectory and this hasn't taken us anywhere? We are still where we are. 40 billion in 2020, 44 billion in 2020, nothing happened. And now we are collecting 51. And what do you think anything was changed after the 51 billion? We will be back here, in 3 years, asking ourselves what happened to the 51 billion. God forbid.
And that reminds me of a statement that was made by a political leader that cited that you should put money into the hands of leaders that already have a mastery of money, because if not, this would definitely lead to mismanagement. But that is not a topic of discussion. Now, back to you, Mr. Opolu. We listened to your co-panelists, and of course, he cited something that it has to do with leadership, and as well, getting from what Dr. Fungat said, as an analyst, as the executive director of Africa Bridge Initiative, what would you say? Do you believe that looking at Africans, if Africans could consider themselves as reliable partners, if Africans could, say, build a solidarity amongst themselves and collaborate with each other, is going to go a long way in solving this looming debt crisis that the continent is facing?
All right, so for Africa as a continent, united we stand, divided we fall. When we have one single currency for Africa, paying back our loan will be seamless. When we have visa-free Africa continents, paying back our loan will be easy. When we have a customized seaport for African continents, free trade zone within the African continent, then we can break the economic oligarchy of China. When we have a unified payment system in Africa, when we have a unified innovation in terms of ICT in Africa, then we can break the chain of neo-economic colonialism being posited by the Chinese. Don't forget, there is nothing free anywhere, including the free town. No man gives you a loan without interest. And the interest of China is not to collect back the money. The interest of China is to what? Collect and overtake our natural resources. We have billions of dollars worth of lithium in Nigeria. We have gold. We have copper. We have different, more than 500 natural mineral resources in Nigeria that can't even sustain the entire Africa. But the question is, when we have leaders who do not understand sustainable development, then borrowing will always be an option. Like my other co-panelist said, when you have a leader that refuses to think, because economy in 21st century, we cannot compare it with 19th and 18th century. The economy of 18th century is manual, is locomotive in nature. But the economy of 21st century has to do with what? Thinking, innovation, thinking out of the box. Economy of 21st century has to do with paying sacrifices. But unfortunately, Our leaders are not ready to pay the sacrifice. Sacrifice of removing personal gain. Sacrifice of making national interest above personal interest. Sacrifice of uniting the economy of Africa. Sacrifice of increasing the GDP of Africa. Sacrifice. We need leaders that understand sacrifice in leadership. As of today, the entire GDP of Africa is not equivalent to 4 multinational companies in the United States of America. So we cannot even play among the global leaders. We are not part of the global leaders. We are deceiving ourselves when we go for global leadership summits. And that is why each time African leaders go for leadership summit in the Western world, the only thing they do is to what? Begging for loan, begging for grants, because they do not understand critical thinking, innovative solution to the economy. This is what we are saying. African leaders must rise up and unify Africa. Then we can begin to talk about breaking the oligarchy and the economic colonialism of the Chinese over the continent of Africa.
Absolutely. It's all about Africans coming together for them to foster the development and growth of the continent. Now, to you, Dr. Fonga, you listen to what your co-panelists had to say. What's your reaction to that?
I think that it is brilliant, and I think that we have come to a place where we have to start doing what is needful on the continent of Africa to help us get to where we are supposed to be. There are things that just has to be done. We must be able to fully understand that we must get into the area where we stop exporting raw materials out to the West and to the East, and we have to start converting some of these raw materials into semi or finished goods. That's the only way we build up our local industries. That's how we create jobs. That is how we also become competitive in the marketplace. We cannot just continually be shipping things out of the country, shipping raw materials out of the country. You have folks who went to school, you know, educated in food sciences, you know, they have the ability to work on machinery and do a couple of things, and yet we're exporting cocoa beans out of the continent instead of building factories where we convert cocoa beans into chocolate and somewhat semi-finished products or chocolate, paste in batch and ship them out of the country, to other companies that can be able to convert them further. We need to be able to tap deeply into the resources that we have, which means we must heavily invest in industrialization. We have to be able to build machineries. We have to build industries. We must be able to do that. We cannot continually just be a consumer-based economy, importing. Every single thing else that we have on the continent of Africa is imported from somewhere. I mean, why? I mean, look, as far as something as simple as toilet roll, toilet paper. I have someone who works in a place called Douala, Cameroon, and he owns a production facility where they produce toilet roll. There is nothing in Cameroon that is used in the production of toilet roll. There is a company outside of Yaoundé, which is owned by a Chinese guy, that converts paper, waste paper, converts that into tissue paper that they use in producing toilet roll. That's why most of the toilet roll you find in places like Cameroon are quite, brownish in color. That's from paper waste. But this young man imports his paper, his toilet roll in barges, gigantic rolls of toilet roll comes into the country, all right? But yet we have everything it takes to be able to produce our own toilet rolls in Cameroon. The roll in which you will think that brown stock roll in which we wrap the toilet roll over, you will think that we produce that in Cameroon. No, that too is imported. That stuff comes from somewhere in Ghana. All right, nothing that we use, I'm talking about as simple as the toilet roll, toilet tissue that we use in Cameroon, none of that stuff is manufactured in Cameroon. And if you think Ghana is doing better, forget it. None of that too is manufactured in Ghana. All right, it's just imported into Ghana, and that's what they do. Somebody needs to fact check me on that, but that's what I know. And so the reality is we have to be able to push our civilization, push our continent to a place where we begin to manufacture the things that we need. And if you think we do not have the market, you are joking. We have the market on the African continent. If one country begins to produce, the other countries will basically get into the market as well. But most likely, that one country that is producing, let's say some entrepreneur in Nigeria begins to produce, high quality toilet paper based upon every single thing else that they have. That means the raw materials comes from Nigeria. And now they're now able to export that, sell it to other African countries. That is good for the Nigerian economy, and it's also good for the economies that those papers are being shipped into, because obviously it creates jobs in those areas as well. We have to consume what's African. We must be able to get into that consciousness that we need to start spending money on what is African, not what is foreign. But if somebody wants to show that they're better in terms of their status, you can tell from what they wear. You can tell from what they drive. You can tell from the way they talk, what they eat and what they drink. Somehow our local produce does not basically push you up, to a status level. You want to be known and recognized. So our appetite for what is foreign has basically grown higher as opposed to what's domestic. We must look African, talk African, feel African, breathe African, consume African, and be able to produce African. That's the way we take this thing forward. That's the way we take ourselves out of all of these foreign debts that, we are enslaving our children in. Just like Patrice Lumumba said, if we are not careful, a day will come when we will migrate from speaking Douala, Ashanti, Igbo, Yoruba, we'll start speaking, Chinese. We'll be so good in Mandarin, they'll wake you from your grave. You will not realize that this is Africa anymore.
Thank you immensely. And of course, it's worth noting, ladies and gentlemen, that some of this debt, if it continues to loom over time, not just the generation will be paying them, but the future generations to come. Thank you immensely, Dr. Fungat. Now to proceed with you, Mr. Kimbi. You listen to your co-panelists. How can the African continent stand this debt struggle which is facing to push for economic growth and development on the continent meets this call for a reform in the global financial architecture?
Yeah, addressing Africa's debt structure while fostering economic growth and development requires a multifaceted approach. Here's how the continent can navigate its debt challenges and push for progress amid calls for global financial reform. So, firstly, by restructuring debt and relief. One of the most immediate steps African nations can take is to pursue comprehensive debt restructuring and relief. This involves negotiating with creditors for more favorable terms, such as extended repayment periods, reduced interest rates, and partial debt forgiveness. Engaging in multilateral debt relief initiatives, such as those supported by international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, can also provide significant relief and free up resources for development in Africa. Secondly, by diversifying economies, to reduce dependency on external debt and improve resilience, African countries should focus on diversifying their economies. So by investing in various sectors such as agriculture, technology, and renewable energy, nations can create new revenue streams and reduce reliance on borrowing. So diversification also helps mitigate the impact of global economic fluctuations and enhances overall economic stability. Thirdly, by strengthening domestic revenue sources. Enhancing domestic revenue generation is crucial for reducing debt dependency. African governments can focus on improving tax collection systems, expanding tax base, and combating tax evasion. By increasing fiscal revenues, countries can reduce their reliance on external borrowing and, better fund essential services and also development projects. So, in summary for this, Africa's approach to managing its debt structure while promoting economic growth involves a combination of immediate debt relief measures, a long-term economic diversification, and enhanced domestic revenue itself. So by addressing these areas strategically, the continent can work towards a more sustainable and prosperous economic future.
Now, to proceed with you, Mr. Opalua, you listened to what Mr. Kimbe had to say as far as that is concerned, but in a bit to deviate ourselves from the matter at hand or his contribution, what do you think, or how do you think that the African continent can resolve its own debt crisis through reviewing some of the policies that already exist, which might, to some extent, not suit the current context which the African continent happens to find itself in?
All right, so for Africa as a continent, we must understand that the development of each of the countries of Africa will, in return, affect the continent. So, look at the policy of subsidy removal in Nigeria. As of today, as of last year, we're buying fuel, we're buying PMS, that is the petrol, we're purchasing it at the rate of 300, 400, 500. But as of today, the price of PMS in the market is going for 1,300, 1,400 naira. So where is the gap coming from? Where is the challenge coming from? And I also understand that this particular fuel subsidy removal policy has also affected so many West African countries, if not almost all the African countries. So where is the gap coming from? The gap is coming from, number one, we need to look inward. Before bringing out a policy like subsidy removal on the PMS, do we have alternative for the PMS as of today? Are we ready to channel our resources into the alternative energy resources? How intentional are we in capacity building of our citizens to be able to engage them in the alternative energy resources? We are talking about renewable energy. China will not give you renewable energy. China will only sell renewable energy to Africa. China will not give it for free. So if we are ready to embrace renewable energy, then we must diversify our funding, our resources into renewable energy. Once we are able to do that, the pressure on the petrol, on the PMS, will reduce drastically. And when the pressure reduces, our human capacity will develop. Our living standard will be increased. Then there will be what? Mutual development in Africa. Because with renewable energy, there are a lot of taxes that will be generated. Because so many SME holders will be going into that sector. And as they are going into that sector, the national or subnational governments in different countries of Africa will be getting huge taxes, huge revenue. When you have massive revenue as a result of your internal diversification of economy, the pressure on the dollar will reduce. And you can maximize profit locally. Because the major challenge we have in Africa is that we are not maximizing our revenue locally. We are only maximizing revenue globally. And the revenue we are maximizing globally, that revenue is not coming to Africa. That is the problem we are having. Our revenue is going directly to the Western world. And unfortunately, China has given us this $51 billion so that they can be part of that revenue that is going to be coming out of Africa. It's unfortunate. Where do we go from here? We need solid local investment in the renewable energy. We need solid local investments. Mark my word. We need solid local investment in agriculture. If you are still relying on international investments, the revenue will not come to you. The revenue will go back to the country that is giving you those billions. So, Africa must rise up to develop Africa by local investments. And this local investment can only come through our local investors, because we have giants within Africa. We have the likes of Aliko Dangote. We have the likes of Femi Otedola, who are giants globally. When we embrace diversity in our economy, they can be able to channel their global investment. They can be able to channel it locally. And when they channel their investment locally, the revenue will become local and the development will become local. That is a new way to develop Africa.
Absolutely, and you've cited brilliant points that Africa will need to take into consideration as far as overturning this debt crisis is concerned. Now, staying with you, Mr. Opoluwa, do you subscribe to the idea of a reform in the global architecture or a global financial architecture? Because as numerous leaders on the African continent have highlighted that this is going to go a long way in benefiting the continent. And I recall recently we had experts across Africa that were in line with or aligned with that idea. Now, being an expert, do you believe that a reform within the global financial architecture is going to go a long way in suiting the debt crisis on the African continent?
All right, so that's a fantastic question. But two things are involved. Number one, who is in charge of the global financial structure? It is the Western world. Who is in charge of the loan? Is the Western world. So these two people are in charge. So these two people will determine the structure of that international financial system. So no matter how you tend to structure it, don't be deceived. The structure will be to their favor. The structure will always be to their favor. So restructuring the financial system in the global world cannot favor Africa, no matter how you tend to look at it, because they are dictating the pipe and the tune. So Africa must develop Africa.
Indeed, the African continent must develop the African continent. Now, since we're gradually coming to the end, I'd just like to reiterate to our audience that we're streaming live on our social media platforms. Meanwhile, you're watching us on For You Television Africa, and of course, listening to us on For You Radio Africa FM 96.3, and of course, on our application on your mobile devices. Now, to conclude with you, Mr. Opoluwa Taiwo, Executive Director at the Africa Bridge Initiative, who's joining us all the way from Nigeria. You've cited key points that Africa needs to take into consideration rather than, say, getting to a table where Africa's voice can be heard. But in a way to chart the way forward, what do you think were some of the suggestions that the African continent would have to take into consideration as far as getting out of this debt trap is concerned, and of course maximizing some of the partnerships that come to its table so it turns out in its own benefit? Mr. Opoluwa, are you with us? Unfortunately, it's like Mr. Opoluwa is not with us, but all the same, we're hoping, ladies and gentlemen, we have been discussing all through today's edition with our seasoned guest and the course of the 2024 FOCAC Summit that is wrapping up this day in Beijing, China, where, of course, China had initiated or plurged some $51 billion to the African continent in terms of fresh fund in the sectors of economic development, or better still, to boost in infrastructure on the African continent. As what is worth noting, why our guests have been citing that this comes amidst the looming debt crisis on the African continent. I would like to reiterate a statement made by President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa during the course of this summit, that these fresh fund, or better still, the relations that the African continent has with China is not going to lead the continent into an economic doom. And of course, it's in line with statements equally made by the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo that China stands to be a reliable partner for the African continent. Meanwhile, Africans, Pan-Africanists, or better still, experts on the African continent, in line with our guest of today, have cited that Africa needs to get to a table where it gets to renegotiate the terms of some of the deals that do exist between the continent and the foreign partners, while trying to call for accountability. And of course, this is at the time where it is mentioned that it's imperative for Africans to be accountable about the funds that get into the African continent, so it is used for the betterment of the African continent, citing that Africa stands to be a mineral-rich continent. Meanwhile, we just got indications that Mr. Opoluwa is back with us. Okay, in a bit to conclude today's edition of the program, Mr. Taiwo, now what is the way forward and what suggestions should be taken into consideration as far as today's topic of discussion is concerned?
Africa, diversify our economy. Africa, build Africa. No continent in the world will build Africa. Africa must be ready to build Africa. Africa must be ready to open the borders within Africa. Bringing goods and services from Nigeria to Cameroon should be seamless. Bringing goods and services from Senegal to Nigeria should be seamless. We are always quick to have comparative analysis with the Western world, but there is European Union and there is currency and visa seamlessness within European Union. Africa, too much of visa processes, too much of international trade policies. Each of the trade policies in Africa must be streamlined to unified Africa. Our trade policy must be streamlined. Our visa processes must be streamlined. And also, we must be intentional about growing local production. I repeat, we must be intentional in growing local production in the area of agriculture, in the area of natural resources. Africa continent, our bedrock is agriculture. We must be ready to go back to agriculture. Without agriculture, there's nothing called Africa. So the real giant that is coming out of Africa must be channeled through diversification and solid local investment in agriculture. When we have a robust agricultural sector within Africa, the Western world, we have no choice than to bring us on board to negotiate economic policies rather than coming over to collect the Greek package that will never be favorable. Africa must develop Africa.
Africa must develop Africa, indeed. And of course, Africa needs to see itself as a giant, so the world can see it as a giant. Thank you, Mansia, Mr. Opoluwa, for taking our time to be with us this day.
Thank you for having me. Always excited about Africa, my continent.
Absolutely, and of course that's why we host programs like these in the bid to change the narrative within the African continent. Of course, we would not be parting ways without me acknowledging the presence of Dr. Stanley Fungot and Mr. Gilbert Kimbe for their brilliant participation in the course of today's edition of the program. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, I've been Jake Snabasi for presentation. I'll leave you in the company of our numerous programs on 4U Media Africa. Do have a great weekend.